Hey Internet. Well, today I want to do something a little different. I've talked a lot about stuff that I really like. I'd like to talk about some stuff that I don't like. I respect the fact that these are opinions of mine, and I know that not everyone's going to agree with me here. Now, I'm taking a general approach to each item on this list, but I'm also aware that they can work well in certain settings. Now, I'm using Guild Wars 2 as an example of a game that is at least partially guilty of most of these in one way or another. Despite its flaws, I really like Guild Wars 2, and it's a world I enjoy spending time in. Now, I've tried to list these in reverse order to the order in which they annoy me, so 10 is the least annoying and 1 is the most. Alright, let's get into it. Number 10. Over-reliance on proximity to benches and craft stations. To be clear, just using benches and crafting stations is a fine enough mechanic. It only becomes a problem for me when you have to be in one place to do all of your crafting. You have to look for places to craft, you can't just make things in your inventory, you have to discard items a lot, which can, in a lot of cases, just be a waste of time. This might be in the vein of encouraging exploration, but often you just go back to the same spot over and over. It works well if a game makes exploration fun in other ways. Like if you want to stroll through town to find the blacksmith shop because you'll find a lot of cool things along the way, like meeting companions or getting new quests. Or the place where all the craft stations are is where a bunch of players congregate. It's even worse when you can't pack up the bench and take it with you, rather than having to break it down into its base components and then having to build it again, needing to make sure you always have the right amount of specific resources to rebuild it. This one's even more annoying when you can't make your own craft stations, but have to use ones placed in the world. I mean, unless there's a gameplay reason, like you have to clear out a nest of monsters to get to the magical forge to make the super hammer or something, but for everyday mundane crafting, no thanks. So how can we fix this? Well, in a game where building is an option, as I stated earlier, we could allow players to carry benches around in the inventory in some form. Maybe they have a lot more weight, or maybe there's a lore reason why you can magically condense them into a small package. Some tools should be mobile, like instead of benches, you need to have a hammer, or saw, or wrench in your inventory. Treat the tool more like an ingredient that isn't used up. We could also allow more items to be craftable in the inventory with only complex items requiring a bench nearby. This is especially true in games where we find or make prefabricated parts that we then assemble into the item we want. You don't need a bench to assemble something like an arrow if you have all the materials handy. Maybe you just need to use a forge to cast the arrowheads or a workbench to make the shafts. Same for tools. You need a forge for the metal parts that you then just assemble in your inventory. Okay, next one. Number 9. An inability to easily access information on resources in-game. This can make crafting a confusing mess if your short-term memory isn't good like mine. You have to pop online and look something up if you don't have enough time to rediscover the information. You have to spend time writing things down outside of the game, referring to notes or forum posts. This can get tedious compared to opening a window and showing information you've gathered as you play. Now, in some narrow contexts, it can be realistic and fit the setting, like where the game wants you to go looking for stuff, and that search is part of your survival experience. But it is an extreme survival mechanic, and it really slows down your pacing. You should be able to track a craftable item. You should be able to track individual resources. You should have an info panel which updates when you learn about a resource to know where you've got it and where it's often found. Access should be made readily available. Building up a list of discovered items gives a sense of accomplishment and a reason to keep exploring. As I said earlier, lacking this mechanic can be useful in certain exploration and survival games, but even then it can be annoying. Chances are, if you were in a survival situation, you'd probably try and remember where you found something. Like where the berries that don't make you sick are, or where the rabbits hang out. So what do we do here? This one should be a simple fix. Now, I acknowledge that some games will require players to use their memory as part of the gameplay. So let's say that this doesn't apply to those games. My point is that most games that do this probably don't need to. It wouldn't negatively impact the experience in most cases, in my opinion. So we fix it by having a codex or guide in our inventory that updates as we acquire resources and items. It provides a description of the item itself, where to find it, and if we want to make it super useful, we can show what those items can be used for. I think having to pop off and consult a forum post or wiki is an annoying interruption, and honestly, my memory kind of sucks. We could implement a map tracking system that could either go along with our codex, or could be a simplified version of this type of system, only showing resources you've already learned about. We open our map and can track all the resources in the mapped area. I've found that this is usually good enough, though I still sometimes have to write stuff down to remember what I was looking for and what I was going to use them to make. Now, Props to Guild Wars 2, which does allow you to see resources on the minimap, though in a fairly limited area near your current location. You could also allow the player the ability to track a craftable item from the crafting menu in such a way that it shows us which ingredients we need and how much we currently have. You could also let the player track a specific resource so that a marker or icon shows up in the world when that item is nearby. Alright, next. Number 8. Items require too many ingredients to craft. This one causes a lot of problems for me. You spend too much time going through lists and lists and lists of resources and items to find all the stuff you need. It's not good for someone who has bad short-term memory, like me. It can make you give up crafting in a single session if you just want to play a bit. I want to feel like I'm making a bit of progress on my in-game projects while I'm playing. I don't want to spend all my time memorizing lists of parts and ingredients. On the upside, having lots of technical information to think about, you can kind of nerd out. You can feel like you're more involved in the world. Feel like you really know your craft skills, so it's not all bad if you're really into immersion. It can be confusing to try to remember everything, and going through all those lists and menus can just kind of burn up your time. It gets worse when many or most of the items you need are ones you have to craft and can't buy or find. So what do we do? This one is, to the credit of game designers who have tried to handle it, a tough one. You have to balance the feeling of a real craft system with the limitations of trying to mimic them with game mechanics in a way that fits the setting but isn't too annoying for you or your players. Some games let you click on the item, then on each individual ingredient, which will take you to another page listing the ingredients for that item, and so on. This is not the most elegant solution, but it does make it easier to refer back to what you need without having to look through a bunch of menus to find each thing. Paired with another system, like a codex or tracking system, as I mentioned earlier, it can make it easier when you can't think of a way to use fewer materials for your parts and your items. Speaking of, maybe we just need to use fewer parts for our items. Now, I am, once again, going to bring up Arcanum. I feel like I bring it up every video, but it's got to be one of my favorite retro games, hands down. Each item you craft requires 2 ingredients, no more. Some of those ingredients have to be found, bought, or crafted, so there's sometimes a chain of items to craft, but never too many. That said, it works really well here because there aren't that many craftable items in the game. But in a game with a larger selection, it could be paired with an easily navigable menu chain or an information menu that could really simplify the process. A ton of the ingredient items in Arcanum are also usable items on their own, so that makes carrying them valuable, which actually brings us to our next point. Number 7. Having to craft tons of junk items to train a craft skill or gather tons of junk to craft with. It's really annoying to have to constantly think about whether your inventory is filling up. In a non-survival setting, it takes away from the experience of enjoying the world while exploring or doing quests. Having to spend lots of time creating tons of the same thing over and over to grind is usually not fun. Now, having lots of junk to sell can make you a profit. It can also provide a good way to create urgency or a sense of having to manage inventory or prioritize in a survival setting. It can provide some sense of realistic tension when the story calls for it, so it works in some contexts, like Fallout or other survival games. It can work alright in a game that includes other useful inventory and resource management strategies, so maybe this one isn't as bad as I'm making it out to be. As far as a solution, like with number 8, this one can be difficult to solve if you've built your craft system in a particular way. But also like with number 8, the problem for the player can be at least made less frustrating with proper item tracking and the ability to easily access information about items and where to get them in the game. I have to admit, I don't readily have a solution to this one, but I often encounter it, so I don't know, maybe it's just something we have to live with. Number 6. Crafted items are automatically bound to a character or account. I should say about this one that mechanics where items are bound to a character or to an account aren't always bad. They can be useful, and I'll discuss why in a moment, but binding items can become a problem if every single item has to bind to its user. Can't be sold, can't be traded, and in some cases can't be broken down. Guild Wars 2 is particularly problematic here. Things that suck about this include that you can't swap items with other characters or sell them to other players. It reduces the utility of crafting if you can only make stuff for yourself. And it doesn't feel like a living economy or world if this is done too rigidly. Now, on the upside, it makes it easy and less stressful while selling, fighting, and dying. You won't lose or accidentally sell valuable equipment, so that's a plus. It can be good if an item is available account-wide, where all your characters can have access to it. This does only work in a fairly narrow range of game types, though. It can make it difficult to make money as a crafter, and craft skills are less used in a group setting, so it's less fun if you like playing in large groups. It's often used to control in-game economies and sometimes help increase in-game monetization, which, I don't know, I'm not suggesting anything here, let's move on. So what do we do about it? Maybe items aren't automatically bound to your character or account. You have to go out and find a rare item that allows you to bind the thing. It might get a bit repetitive after a while, but it'll keep some people interested enough, and it means that if a player wants to bind their items so they don't risk losing them, they can, while others can play with the threat of frustration at all times for whatever reason. The simplest way, of course, is just to allow a player to check a box binding the item if they want, without affecting any other mechanics. If it poses a problem of balance in games of a competitive nature, maybe apply a penalty like the item can't be upgraded once bound or something. You might also allow players to go to a certain NPC and pay to have the item bound. Maybe there's a quest involved or something. I don't know, make it fun. Speaking of money, number 5, spending money in place of materials. I've spoken about this one before. It's not the worst offender, and I understand that it's often used as a shorthand to simplify things, which is sometimes necessary. Now, I'm talking about in-game currency, not real-world money, like with microtransactions. I mean spending gold at a station to craft a sword or something. To me, it doesn't feel like a craft system at that point. It feels a lot more like you're just buying things from a merchant. It takes away the fun, for me, of using skills to feel more self-sufficient, and it makes the world feel smaller in a lot of ways. Now, if not used to replace too many systems, it can be a way of simplifying a craft system. It can be easier if you want less to keep track of in terms of various skills and ingredients. Also, some people like showing off their in-game wealth, which, not my thing, but we all play in our own way. This one may be the most controversial on the list because some people enjoy simplicity or have difficulty with overly complex systems. The way I play, I like to see a balance between simplicity and variety that I don't often get when this is the dominant mechanic in a craft system. But comment down below if you disagree with me on this point. So what do we do here? I mean, if it makes sense for your setting, sure. Witcher 3 uses a mechanic like this, and it works pretty well to fit the theme. So I guess what I'm saying is, don't do it unless there's a very good lore-friendly reason. Number 4, your craft skill system is too rigid. This sort of thing allows a lot less experimentation. It allows for less unique character design. You kind of feel locked in and can't switch or retrain skills. You feel the need to make a new character, which kind of sucks if you prefer to play as a single character and you want to really get into the story with them. I'm talking mostly about systems where you get a narrow range of craft skills and you can only specialize in 1, 2, or 3 of a whole bunch of them. You can't mix and match skills, and they don't really affect too much else in the game. On the upside, specializing in a narrow range of skills can give you a feeling of accomplishment. A rigid craft system might fit your character or setting better, in which case, sure, go for it. It might not be too annoying, but having to specialize in such a narrow range of skills can be boring. It tends to lack variety. You can only craft items in those skill sets, or the same items have to be available to craft by multiple disciplines. Otherwise, it would be even more annoying to get those items, and they may be required to properly play. This gets boring and redundant. This is a bit of an issue in Guild Wars 2. Some games make it difficult to retrain craft skills as well, which just compounds how annoying this mechanic is. Guild Wars 2 is a little more flexible with this, but not by much. So, one thing you can do, if you do have a very rigid craft system, is allow easy reallocation of skill points so that you can re-specialize on a single character. If that makes things a little too easy, add a hurdle. Like, you can get back your skill points, but you have to go through a training process to reallocate them into the new crafting skill or something. If it doesn't mess with your story or lore, you can allow a character to be a jack of all trades by making the items they can craft at low levels of each skill useful, even at higher levels of gameplay. Maybe your items level with you or something, or the lower tier items are just utility items rather than powerful weapons, which you get at higher tiers and higher levels of the crafting skill. Alright, on to number 3. 3. Crafting systems that just feel bolted on or are unrelated to other skills or in-game actions. This is sometimes a symptom of pressure from higher up the design chain, where developers feel the need to put a craft system into a game that doesn't really need one. You can tell it doesn't really fit the world or setting. Training craft skills kind of doesn't feel worthwhile. It doesn't mesh well with other systems, meaning you often have a bunch of mechanics and things that you have to learn that are unrelated to other gameplay elements. Craft skills don't affect other skills as well, which just makes training them boring. On the upside, the one benefit I can think of for a system like this is that if you don't want to interact with the crafting system in a game, like you find those mechanics boring, you don't have to enjoy the rest of the gameplay. I don't think this is a good enough benefit to justify having a system like this, but it might appeal to some people. So what are our solutions here? If your game doesn't need a crafting system, don't put one in. Consider using a smaller crafting system, like allowing players to modify gear if you can fit it in. Also, try not to include skills that don't influence other parts of the game in a meaningful way. I discussed this type of system in a video I put it a couple of weeks ago. I'll link it in the description if you haven't seen it yet. So, next one. 2. Long craft times. Unless the setting and theme explicitly require it, it creates real-life impatience for me. It leads to resentment, or sometimes just causes me to give up on the crafting altogether instead of taking the time to do it. Now, it can give you a sense of urgency or increase tension in high survival settings. You have to learn to prioritize, so sometimes it can be useful, but it's especially annoying if your timers are hours or days long and need to be reduced with purchases and microtransactions. So, if your craft timers are very long and you can't or don't want to reduce them, make it easy for players to pass time quickly by just sitting or meditating with the click of a button. There's no reason to make things hard just for the sake of it, and I think that if you want to add an element of tension or make your players prioritize time, maybe the advancement of days via meditation or sleeping advances something like food decay, or removes beneficial buffs that then have to be reapplied or something. So, that subject leads us nicely into our number one mechanic that I do not like. Number one, daily progression and gathering limits. I really, 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 really hate this one. I don't have much good to say here. I can't think of a good reason to have this in a game. It's extremely frustrating when you have to pause your crafting or building until the next day when you can get more materials. The wait times can be a target for excessive monetization. It actually takes away from the realism in games where that's relevant. It forces you to have to use other characters in some cases, which I personally find frustrating. It interrupts role-playing. It's just really, really frustrating. It can be used to keep engagement high, but you shouldn't have to resort to something like that if a game has an interesting story or fun stuff to do. In my opinion, it can be a sign of a bad game. Not always, but it is a big red flag for me. Now, it bothers me that this is present in Guild Wars 2, in particular because Guild Wars 2 is an interesting game. There's so much to do. You have exploration, character leveling, meta events, guild events, world bosses, PvP, world versus world, faction maps, and a million interesting things to interact with. And when I build, I just want to build until I feel like stopping. So, solutions. Don't do it. Just say no to daily limits. I'm sure there are some arguable justifications for this mechanic, but I can't think of one that makes me think it's worth having. It's just annoying, and I really hate it. If your game is interesting, you don't need it. And if the rest of your game sucks so much that you need to do this to keep players engaged, make another game instead. So, that's my list. Sometimes I find that these items can be red flags of a game that's not very well designed, but not always. I get frustrated when I see these things in games that I otherwise like. I find that they take away from the experience more than they add to it. I think that we can find different solutions to turning these challenges into puzzles that we experience through game mechanics. So, if you agree or disagree, let me know in the comments below. If you liked the video, hit like. If you want to see more, hit subscribe. It really does help. I appreciate all of you and everyone who takes the time to watch. Until next time, may your craft times be short, may your inventory be manageable, and may you always find a craft station when you need one. Bye, Internet.